So welcome everybody, aloha. Welcome to Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month. We're kind of getting near the end of the month, but we've had a great 2 weeks of presentations from Hawaii Island, Maui, and now we're here on Oahu, but we're also, integrating statewide concepts about invasive species. So I'm really happy to have Katie Ersbak from the Department of Land and Natural Resources, Division of Forestry and Wildlife. She is a watershed planner over there. Just a quick background, she was born and raised in California, but has called Hawaii her home for the last 12 years. She worked at DLNR'S Water Commission and also as a researcher in disaster preparedness, which is really cool. Has a really interesting background. She received her master's degree from the University of Hawaii in Urban and Regional Planning Department. And she's here to talk to us today about protecting our forests from hooved animals, trends, progress statewide. So we're really happy to have her. Again, my name's Chelsea. If you didn't see the webinar before, I'm a planner with Hawaii Invasive Species Council. And we also have Randy Bartlett here to help us out with the webinar from HISC also. So Katie, I will pass it over to you to share your screen. Just to let folks know, we will have time for discussion, Q&A. You can put your questions into the Q&A or chat box along the way. All right, I will pass it over now.
So aloha, kako, everyone who's joining today. I looked briefly at the participant list. There's a lot of names that I don't know. So that's great to see new faces virtually, I guess. Chelsea, thank you for that introduction. Again, my name is Katie Ersbak. I'm a watershed planner with the state of Hawaii, Division of Forestry and Wildlife. This presentation was actually supposed to originally be given by my colleague, Emma Ewan. She unfortunately couldn't make it today, so I'm filling in kind of last minute. But the topic today is really to give you folks an idea about the work that the State Division of Forestry and Wildlife is doing in collaboration with a variety of our partner groups to protect our forests from invasive species, specifically hooved animals, or what we call ungulates. So that would include pigs, deer, goats, etc., which are having a huge impact on our native ecosystems here in Hawaii. So I'll give you an overview about why the work we do is valuable and important, as well as a look at the trends and our progress statewide in removing hooved animals from our native ecosystems. So a quick overview about the Division of Forestry and Wildlife. We are a division within the state of Hawaii under the Department of Land and Natural Resources. So we're one of about 11 different divisions under DLNR. We're the largest division, and we're also the oldest forest management agency in the US, which is a fun fact that not many people know. We were established in 1903 during the time of the Territory. And at that time, we were seeing huge impacts to our forests, again, from non-native hooved animals primarily, that were causing widespread destruction and devastation of our forests. And as a result of that, we were seeing less water recharged into our streams and into our aquifers. So the Territory at the time decided that something needed to be done, established a forestry agency with the main mission to protect our important watershed forests, which are providing life-giving water to not only residents, but a variety of other things like agriculture as well. So today, DOFA manages nearly 1 million acres statewide. That's roughly a quarter of the land in the entire state. So we have a huge kuleana, or responsibility, that includes forest reserve areas, natural area reserves, designated wildlife sanctuaries. Within these forest reserves and other areas, we have public hunting opportunities, we have trails, we manage for endangered species. So we do a lot. Speaking of endangered species, we, as a state, have about 1/3 of all listed endangered species that call Hawaii home. Yet we represent less than 1% of the land mass in the US. So it's a sizable amount of plants and animals that are considered endangered that call Hawaii home, and we also have a responsibility to protect them. And they call our forests home as well in many cases. So why do we need to protect our forests? Why is this important? Well, again, one of the main reasons is for water security, water recharge. Our forests provide life-giving water. They collect it through rain and moisture. Here on the screen, you'll see an olelo no'eau, which basically says that the rain follows the forest. So where you have a forest, you have rain, you have water, and you have life. Our forests are also great for other reasons, not just water capture, but they also are good for climate change, capturing carbon, so storing that carbon, and erosion and water quality issues as well, which I'll get into in a little bit. So again, carbon sequestration. This is probably not a new concept to folks on this call, but forests are definitely a valuable asset when it comes to carbon storage. So as we see a decline in our forests, and here in Hawaii, when we say decline, that usually means they're being overtaken by either non-native plant species or a combination of non-native plant species and invasive ungulates. And when you see that impact, you're just going to have less canopy cover, you're going to have less trees and less vegetation. So you see a degradation of forests, which then leads to less carbon capture. Our forests are also great at capturing and storing water and preventing that water from impacting and running off into our coastal regions. So when we talk about stormwater management, a lot of folks like to talk about the work done in our urban areas, so with city and county agencies primarily, but stormwater is actually a MALCA issue as well. So when we say MALCA, we mean upland forested areas. And that's really the origin of where all of our water is coming from. So where you have a forest and you have that capture by the vegetation, you're going to see less impact downstream where water, if it's not captured by vegetation, can quickly run off, carrying sediment, nutrients, and causing huge issues with erosion. So keeping our upland areas forested is one of these ways that we can reduce sedimentation into our streams and improve water quality. We know this is true because we have a variety of studies that tell us so. There's a couple studies done locally here that are assessing the impacts of erosion in forested areas versus bare ground. And as you can see from this graphic, when you have bare ground, you have significantly higher erosion rates versus in an area of undisturbed forest where there's still vegetation. Here's an image of what a healthy native forest should look like. You can see a multi-level canopy. You have your Ohia making up the bulk of the tree species in this photo, but you also have mosses and ferns and other shrubby vegetation below that. So it really creates this multi-level canopy that's great at capturing and storing and slowing down that flow of water. Unfortunately, when you have ungulates present in these environments, they like to root around, trample native vegetation, eat vegetation, introduce non-native invasive species that can outcompete the native species, leaving these pockets of bare ground, which are obviously much more prone to erosion. This is an aerial image from Kohala on Hawaii Island, just showing kind of where this widespread ungulate damage is taking place. So all that bare ground is caused by mostly pigs in this case, just rooting around and destroying all the vegetation. Zoomed out even more, you can see those brown areas are pretty widespread and prevalent in this region. And this is the case in many places statewide, not just on Hawaii Island. So we're experiencing these issues all across the state. Here is an image from the south slope of Molokai, also showing the south slope being heavily inundated by just years and years and decades of ungulate activity. In this case, you have a lot of deer and goats that are eating the vegetation and just leaving bare ground behind. So another study has shown that in this particular region, we're seeing 100 times the natural rate of erosion just caused by mostly ungulate activity. So invasive species just impacting this area tremendously. And that has implications for not only stream water quality, but also ocean and marine water quality. The south slope of Molokai has one of the longest fringing reefs and is used as a source of sustenance and food for the local community. So making sure that these reefs and oceans are not impacted by sedimentation is also a marine issue as well as a Mauka forest issue. We also have some studies showing a reduction in flood because of vegetation. So if we're able to keep the landscape vegetated, we can also see a reduction in flood rates. This study was done using different land cover change scenarios. So looking at forested versus conversion to grassland versus conversion to bare ground where you have no vegetation. And it basically showed that in the bare vegetation scenario where there's no vegetation, you see an increase in peak flows by about 40%, which is a huge number. And this is one of the first studies to actually show that connection between forest cover and reduction in flood impacts. So more than just sedimentation, ungulates like pigs produce a huge amount of waste through their poop and other droppings. All that has to go somewhere, and in some cases it will get channelized into our streams and water systems. An interesting fact is that Hawaii has the highest prevalence of this NTM lung disease in the US, which I wasn't aware of until recently. But there's a lot of human and health impacts associated with feral ungulates, which I don't think we fully understand and are just starting to figure out now. But because pigs are found throughout all of our forests here in Hawaii, it's definitely an issue that we're looking into because they can have health implications, not just sediment and erosion implications. So how do we protect our forests? One of the main ways we do that is through watershed, what we call watershed fencing. So this is an image from Makaha Valley here on Oahu. You can see this fence line running down the middle, of this ridge. On the left is protected. So there's forest there. On the right is not protected. So it's still being impacted by goats. So that you can see that there's no vegetation there. And again, lots of erosion is probably happening on that side of the hillside. Fences are also showing to be very critical in our ability to combat new diseases like rapid Ohia death. I'm not sure if there's been a talk on that as part of this month, but I'm sure there is. And Ohia, because it's one of our keystone species here in Hawaii, it's really critical that we try to figure out how to manage the spread of that disease, because what it does is essentially kill off old growth Ohia forests at a very, very rapid rate. And the way that it does that is by infecting the bark of a tree. Usually if there's some sort of wound or scar in the tree, that's kind of how it can make its way in. So obviously ungulates like cattle and pigs like to root around trees. They can cause damage to trees, creating those holes and wounds where rod can infect a tree. But what we've started to see is that in these fenced or protected areas, we're seeing less occurrence of rapid Ohia death. So that's very promising because it's also showing that our fences are helping limit the spread of this really damaging and deadly pathogen. Here is an overview kind of just showing where we're at in terms of forest loss over the last century or so. We've basically lost over half of our native forests statewide, with only a little bit remaining in these certain Mauka areas. And of those Mauka areas that still have native forests, those are the areas that we're primarily interested in protecting and managing for these invasive species. So you can see here that we've started to do that work, but quite a significant amount of land is still unprotected, and that's what we're interested in trying to protect. And here's just some island-specific maps to give you a better idea about what's being what's being protected currently and what we've lost. I think it's most striking here on Oahu, where you can see we've definitely lost more than half of our native forests. And what remains, very little of that is actively being protected now, although we hope that that is changing. And that's one reason why money from our state legislature in the form of capital improvement project or CIP money is so critical and so vital, because that's really the money that helps build these protective watershed fences. And I think Christy Martin, who's speaking after me, is going to go into a bit more detail about ways to support this work if you're involved in the legislative process. So as part of this protection initiative, what we call the Watershed Initiative, we have a goal to protect 30% of these remaining native forest areas by the year 2030. We're almost halfway to that goal. We have about 17% currently protected. Another 20% is funded or under construction, so fences in progress of being built. And then we also have a request this session for the biennium budget FY 22-23, requesting an additional $4 million a year, which would protect an extra 20,000 acres in our goal to reach 30%. Here you can see how that CIP funding has tended to fluctuate over the years. Since FY13, which is the first year we started using CIP to build these fences, we've had some good years, we've had some lackluster years, but the last few have been really great, and we're incredibly thankful to the state legislature for their support in this effort and the governor. In that time, we've built over 140 miles of fence, and 86 miles are under construction. That CIP money, in addition to other state funds, is actually super critical to our ability to attract other funders and partners to this work. So with that money, we've been able to match funds, almost 40 million since FY13, which is pretty incredible. So we're able to maximize the state dollar invested, and that helps fund not just the construction of these fences, but it's also helping fund local jobs, providing work in some of these communities, especially in places like Molokai, where jobs may be somewhat limited. This funding has proved critical to creating kind of a conservation group of folks who are able to build fences for us, and the CIP money is what is supporting the local jobs and providing work for local residents. And I'll leave you guys on somewhat of a happy note. Obviously, ungulate impacts and issues with pigs and goats and deer are a huge issue that we're trying to combat. But in places where we have been able to fence, like here on Molokai, you can see that in 2009, from the time that we built the fence and removed animals from this area, we have seen an incredible rebirth of native vegetation. So this is an image of that same spot in 2015. And then in 2020, currently, what that site looks like. And this is not the result of us going in and outplanting. This is just natural regeneration. So it just goes to show that when you can fence an area and protect it, and you're able to remove the animals from within inside, you can create healthy native ecosystems again. So there's hope, and we are truly thankful for all the support from our partners for making these projects happen. And that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions that you folks may have.
Awesome job. Thanks, Katie, for that great overview. I don't see any questions right now in the Q&A or the chat, but I have a question for you. For those of us who are interested, what would be the best way you think for us to engage with the legislature and support your funding requests?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, hopefully Christy will go into a bit more detail, but this year the primary request is through the state budget bill, HB 200. That includes our CIP request, so that $4 million annually over the course of the next biennium. So the CIP money is really the only money that we're requesting this session. Just with COVID and other issues, we weren't able to ask for as much as we need. But we're hoping that if we continue this trend of getting CIP money annually, we're going to be able to make headway on a lot of these projects. So I think supporting that budget bill is probably the best way that folks can help us in this initiative.
Okay, and to further that question then, since, the Capitol's shut down pretty much, there's no public access during COVID, since we're still under restrictions, what would be the best way for individuals to engage with the legislature? Would that be online?
Online, they do have a virtual process, testimony process that's been going on for a few weeks now. I'm not intimately familiar with how it's been working, but apparently it is working. And I think there is some guidance on the Capitol website if folks are interested in submitting testimony. So you can submit testimony as normally you would, but if you wanted to testify and actually provide voice to your words on paper, I think you have to sign up through, I think they're using Zoom.
Okay. And then Chelsea did put in the chat a link to the Capitol for that HB 200. Question that just came up in the chat is, how do you decide where the fences go?
Great question. So back in 2011, we went through a process of collecting data and using different models and metrics to figure out what areas had the highest rates of recharge, so rainfall, as well as areas that were probably most prone to conversion to non-native forests, so areas that we wanted to keep native. And using that data, we were able to identify what we call priority 1 and 2 watershed areas. I didn't have a map of that in this presentation, but the priority 1 and 2 areas are the areas that we are really focused on trying to protect and fence. So I think of the 4 million acres in the state, priority 1 and 2 watersheds represents about 824,000 acres. And we're interested in protecting 30% of that. So we know that we probably won't be able to protect everything that we consider priority 1 and 2, but right now the goal is to protect 30% of that.
Okay, awesome. Here's another question from Monty Tudor-Long on Maui. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges and costs of maintaining fences once their installation is complete? What sort of lifespan does fencing have before it needs to be replaced entirely?
Another good question. So our fences, usually the lifespan of a fence is about 30 years. The materials that we use are galvanized steel, so they're pretty durable and able to withstand a lot of the impacts from weather and the elements. In places on like Hawaiʻi Island, where you have impacts from the volcano and bog, those fences we have seen need to be replaced sooner. But on average, we consider our fences to be good for about 30 years. And then occasionally, if there's like a tree fall or a breach in a fence, we'll have to go in and repair it. So that's why our fences get checked quarterly. So someone will actually walk that fence line and check it and make sure it's still in good shape. The funding to make that happen is also typically coming from the state, either CIP or general fund money, and that's paying these field crews, both state field crews as well as watershed partnership groups, who are the ones who are actively going out into the field to maintain these fences.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer and question. Another question is, what are the solutions to the problems associated with pig waste?
Good question. Just getting rid of the pigs is probably the best solution. Yeah, so just limiting the areas that they're impacting. We have certain places that are probably more prone to flooding, so carrying the nutrients further downstream and into these more urban areas. So focusing on pig removal, maybe Malka of those areas could be a first step, although that's not currently in our prioritization scheme, but that's something that we could probably consider looking at more. We're just starting to better understand kind of the human and health impacts of of ungulates and ways that we can best manage them. But just not having them on the landscape is probably the best thing we can do. But there's many of them and we'll never get rid of them. We also have to consider that they're used as a food source and they're a form of recreation for folks. So here at DOFA, we have a complicated dual mandate to both protect our native ecosystems as well as provide for public hunting opportunities. So it's a fine line that we have to walk, and we try to make sure that we make everyone happy.
Yeah, that's a tough job. Good luck with that. Another question from Maui, from Elizabeth Spieth. Do you ever use remote sensing to monitor fence integrity or ungulate incursions?
We have experimented with that. I think you're referring to like maybe the use of drones or things like that. It just line of sight and like battery life of a drone is really short, and you're working in these really remote and rugged areas where you may not have good cell phone service. So unfortunately, it's not that easy to do. And what we've found is that having someone physically walk the line is still the most efficient and effective way.
Okay, and another question is, how do you decide where the fences go?
I kind of touched on that a little bit. So it's based on the prioritization. So priority 1 and 2 watershed areas. So in these areas of our Malka forests that are receiving the highest amount of rainfall and recharge is one of the metrics that we look at. In many cases, these are very remote and rugged terrain. So when you're drawing out like the actual fence line, you're typically following natural topography lines along a ridge or the crest of the mountain. Sometimes you do have to drop into a valley or a depression. There might be a stream or a waterfall. So you try to be strategic about where you tie in your fence lines to make it a cohesive whole unit without any pukas or holes. But natural topography does play a huge role in determining where the units go, as well as their size. So these units can be anywhere from 800 acres to several thousand acres. But we also need to remember that after you fence it and you want to go in and do management and remove pigs, for example, from the area, you need to make sure that you can get crews who want to walk that full 2,000 acres. So you have to consider size when it comes to the long-term management too. You can't just fence the entire Ko'ola summit, although for some people that would be the easiest solution.
Hey, Katie, I have a quick question on that. Do you ever use, or do organizations ever use volunteers to check fence or?
I'm not aware of DOFA using volunteers to check fence, although when I'm out and about just doing volunteer work or on a hike, I will check a fence myself. But no, I mean, I think a lot of folks are aware that these fences are usually managed by the state or a watershed partnership. So if they're hunting in the area or hiking and they see a breach in the fence, they usually know who to contact. And we typically have signage posted on the fences too, letting folks know why the fence is there and who is managing it.
Very cool. Yeah, so please add your questions if you have any more. We're kind of wrapping up. I don't see any new questions in the chat. Give it a minute. But yeah, I just want to thank you, Katie, for doing the presentation, a last minute change up, but it sounds like, I mean, this topic. Oh, we got a couple more questions. Randy, I'll let you take charge of those.
Okay, there's a question from Amrit Krishna. What aspects of ungulate forest interactions require future research?
Well, I think understanding the health and human impacts is one area that we need a bit more research on. It's really hard to know exactly how many animals are out there. We have partnered with folks at UH and other researchers to try to assess ungulate numbers so we can better determine like how much effort might be needed to eradicate them from a particular area or acreage. but it's really hard to say. Those are the two that come to mind off the top of my head in terms of research needs. And also, again, just being aware of the value that ungulates do have for certain members of our community. And we may view them as evil, but we also recognize that people view them, there's cultural significance to them as well as, and also a source of food. So we need to be aware and respectful of differing opinions. And some folks have started to do more like social research on that topic.
Okay, thanks. And another question from Marie Fatuala. Are most of the fence wire fences?
No, not all of them. So we've started to fence more with what we call hog panels, which are more sturdy, just like 6 foot long sections of like an actual panel fence. But some of our older fences were using hog wire. So that was wire that could be rolled and then unrolled. But the hog paneling is a bit more secure and durable than the wire fencing. And in some places, depending on the type of ungulates you're trying to manage, if it's, for example, deer or sheep, that typically can jump over a 6 foot fence, you have to make them higher. So we may include like a combination of paneling as well as wire to top it off.
Okay, great. Thank you for those. And thanks again for taking the time for your presentation and answering these questions. Don't see any more, and I think we're almost out of time. So Chelsea.
Yeah, I don't see any more questions. And I think just, a shout out to all the folks that actually put up ungulate fences because it is really hard work. And it's just respect to the folks that stay out on the mountain for weeks on end, just brutal post pounding, wiring. And I know Katie and Randy have both done the work before. And I think I did a day and a half of it. And I was like, no thanks, I'll stick to plants. I'll take care of the plants. So just a shout out to all the really hard work on all the islands that goes into putting up those fences and protecting our forests, and Katie for just doing the work behind the scenes of getting these folks, paid and the forest protected. So really appreciate the work you and Emma do.